Hi everyone, my name is Matt, and let's paint a few Seraphon Skink models for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. These models are part of the Spawn of Chotec set, and I uploaded the first part last week. If you haven't seen that video yet, check out the link here. After assembling the models, I primed them with gray all over, followed by a heavy spray of white from the top and sides. Then I attached them to corks with a small piece of double-sided tape. For the first layer, I'll be using a mix of 4 parts Aethermatic blue contrast paint and 1 part Lothern blue. It might seem a little odd to mix an opaque acrylic paint with a transparent contrast paint, but there are a couple good reasons for it. The first reason is simply to change the hue of the color. By mixing in a little Lothern blue, it makes the color closer to the box art. But the most important reason is, contrast paint is transparent, which means the base coat layers will show through and influence the final color. By mixing in some opaque paint, it's making the contrast paint semi-opaque. The more opaque a paint is, the less it will be influenced by the layers beneath it, and the final result will be much more smooth. Another factor is viscosity. Contrast paint is very runny and tends to pool and flow into the crevices much more than other paints. By introducing a thicker paint, it makes the mix flow less, which also helps make the final result more smooth and solid. By varying the ratio of the paints, you can capitalize on the different properties of each component and get the mix to perform exactly how you want it to. With that base coat dry, I shaded the skin and scales with Tyran blue shade paint. Work on one section at a time and apply a generous layer of paint to make sure it flows into all the crevices. If the paint collects and pools too much anywhere, use the brush to soak up the excess. Next, I painted all the scales with Ultramarines blue. On some areas the scales are less defined, so I like to create a blended effect with the contrast paint. It's really easy to do. Just paint one section at a time, then rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then run the clean brush along the edge. You may want to paint a second coat depending on how dark the blue is. I want all the ropes and claws to be black, and Dawnstone will provide a great base coat for the next layers. After the Dawnstone dried, I painted the ropes and claws with black Templar. With the black Templar still on my palette, I painted a thin black line around all the other areas. The bracelets, ankle bands, around the back armor, and in between each of the sections on the head crest. I'll be using opaque paint for all the following areas, and those paints will easily cover up any mistakes with the black Templar. Just be careful on the skin and scales, but if you make any mistakes, that's okay. Just leave it for now, and we can touch it up later. Now it's time to start base coating the other areas with opaque paint, And I'm going to start out by painting the head crest sections with Wild Rider Red, making sure to leave a thin line of black along the outside. It may take 2 or 3 layers to build up an even finish. Then I painted the spear with Rhinox hide, making sure to leave a thin black line next to the hands. Just like with the red, paint 2 or 3 layers for an even finish. Then I painted the pouch with Steel Legion Drab. There are a couple things inside which I figured are rocks, and I think I forgot to mention I painted those with Dawnstone earlier. Next I painted the armor, bracelets, and banner icon with Retributor armor. Make sure to leave a thin black outline around all the gold areas. I really like the look of Magos purple over gold, so I'm painting on a layer of that. I want to try and paint the shade in a gradation where one side is darker than the other. First, decide which edge you want more of the wash to collect. Work on one section at a time and apply a generous coat. Then wipe the brush on a paper towel and soak up the excess from one side. If the other side isn't dark enough, grab a little more wash and add it to just that area. Remember that the brush will deposit more paint where it last touches the model, so try to end the brush stroke where you want more paint distributed. After that layer dried, I went back and deepened some of the shadows with a second layer. Next I shaded the leather pouch and the rocks inside it with a coat of Agrax Earthshade. There are a few little details that I want to make look like green marble, and I'll base coat those areas with Fenrisian Grey. With the base coat dry, next I painted a layer of Dark Angel's Green contrast paint. After painting an area, I like to clean the brush and then soak up some of the paint. It can make a cool, swirled, marble-looking effect. I painted the prongs of the spear with black. I picked out the eyes with Balor brown, making sure to leave a thin outline of black around the eye. Then I highlighted the center with toxic yellow. and finally painted a small dot with black. There are a bunch of feathers on this model, and I think I want to paint them in bright colors to match my Agradon model. So I'm starting off by touching up the white undercoat. Because of the way I primed this model, it's more of a really light gray rather than white. I mixed a series of neutral grays from black and white, and this one's pretty close to the primer. I want to have a variety of colors on the feathers, and Iandin yellow will make a good base coat for all of them. Remember, when working with contrast paints, work on one section at a time, apply plenty of paint, and then use the brush to soak up any excess. Next, I picked out a few of the feathers with Magmadroth Flame. This paint is kind of an exception to the rule. It's one of the more opaque contrast paints and tends to dry flat without any shading. So in this case, I'm applying the paint thin and avoiding any pooling. Then I used Blood Angel's Red to paint a few more feathers. Followed by a couple Sigvald Burgundy feathers. Finally, I painted the last couple feathers with Karandras green. If you made any mistakes on the skin or scales, Lothern Blue and Macragge Blue are a pretty close match. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, and that's what I would do on large units, but since there are only a couple here, I'll go ahead and highlight them. For the first highlight stage, I'm going to pick out the edges of the scales with Lothern Blue. These kinds of edge highlights take a lot of time. You could dry brush this stage if you like. Next, it's time to highlight the head crest. They have a blended effect on the box art, but rather than do that, I'm going to do some simple line highlights. I mixed white with the Wild Rider red and made a pinkish salmon kind of color, and then picked out a few of the edges. I highlighted the ropes and claws with Dawnstone, just a thin line on some of the corners. Next I highlighted the edges of the leather bag with Baneblade brown. The shade dried a little glossy here, so it might be kind of hard to see. I painted a highlight along the length of the spear and banner pole with Gorthor brown. Next I highlighted the edges of the green marble areas with Sybarite green. And then I painted some very fine highlights with white. Now to highlight the gold. For the first part, I'm using some slightly thinned Retributor armor with very little paint on the brush, sort of like I'm applying a glaze in some areas. The shade earlier really dulled down the gold, and coming back in with gold will help add a shine, almost like we're polishing it. I like to think about where most of the shade collected, and paint the gold on the opposite side, along with a few of the edges. I think having the bright gold contrasted with a dark shade makes for a more striking finish. With that stage done, it's time for one last highlight on the gold, and for that I'm using a mix of Stormhost silver with a tiny amount of gold. The exact ratio might be something like 10 parts silver to 1 part gold. Since the gold is a much stronger color, start with silver on your palette and add a very small amount of gold until you get a color close to this. Then just work your way around the model and highlight the edges. I like to place the highlights all over the gold, even in the shadow side. Just like with the last step, I think having the contrast of bright highlights next to dark shades makes the armor look more polished and striking. If you have a lot of confidence with the brush, you can paint some highlights on the feathers. I highlighted the dark red feathers with Evil Sun Scarlet, the medium red feathers with Wild Rider Red, the orange feathers with Fire Dragon, the yellow feathers with Toxic Yellow, and for the green feathers I used a mix of Toxic Yellow and Moot Green. I used an old brush to apply some textured paint to the bases. While the paint was still wet, I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the textured paint dried, I painted the whole base with a coat of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown, and then Balor brown. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, shaded them with Agrax Earthshade. I painted the edge of the base with black, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass and clump foliage with superglue. And here are the finished skinks. I really like all the bright colors, and it's got me wanting to try out a few different color schemes. Maybe a yellow and orange scheme to match the spawn. Or a light green would be cool too. What do you think? Have you painted skinks in a color other than blue? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Thanks for making it this far to the end of the video, for liking, sharing, subscribing, and for all of your kind comments. Your support is really helping the channel grow and reach a wide audience. Well, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.